Enlightenment is a men's club, isn't it? I mean, Buddha was male. The Zen masters were almost invariably male in history. The Indian gurus, the Indian saints were almost always male. Those who wrote the books, those who wrote the doctrine, compiled the koans, were all male. Right. Well, there is an exception, an interesting exception. In the Buddhist lineage, what are called the patriarchs, which are the lineage of those who transmitted the Dharma from teacher to student on down the line throughout the last 2,500 plus years to the present. The 27th patriarch, who's a very important patriarch, called Prajnatara. Prajnatara was the teacher of Bodhidharma. And there's the classic question in Buddhism: why did Bodhidharma bring Buddhism from India to China? Well, one answer is because Prajnatara told him to do so. So the very fact that we have access to Buddhism anywhere but India is due to this patriarch, who's most likely a matriarch. So there's some debate on this, but there's some very interesting clues to the fact that, or the probability that Prajnatara was female. One very notable one is that in Dogen's Shobogenzo, the list of all of the patriarchs in order up until Dogen's time, from the time of Buddha, lists the patriarchs as male with one exception, and that is Prajnatara. Also in the Korean Seon tradition, which is the Korean Zen or Chan tradition, this patriarch, this 27th in the lineage, is considered to be female as well. So at least one notable exception in the lineage from Buddha to the present, and a very pivotal exception. Here's a wonderful exchange between Prajnatara and Bodhidharma. The Venerable Prajnatara asks Bodhidharma, "What is it that's formless among things?" Bodhidharma says, "Formlessness is unborn." Prajnatara asks, "What is the highest among things?" Bodhidharma says, "The actual nature is the highest." So with a few notable historical exceptions, the vast majority of the writers, compilers, and recognized teachers in the Eastern traditions, spiritual traditions, were men. Now, does that necessarily mean there weren't teachers that were women that were just not given the same recognition? Certainly there were. Certainly there were female teachers, female deeply realized humans. And certainly there were many deeply realized people who were not teachers who also happened to be female. No doubt about it. Lay practitioners, those who were simply not recognized or noted by name or compiled into the annals of history. But the purpose of this video isn't to discuss the patriarchal history of Eastern wisdom traditions, but rather to just address one possible bias that we may have that may be conscious and it may be unconscious. And that might be that it's more likely for a man to wake up or to become liberated than a woman. And the truth of this, in my experience, is nil. It's just not the case. Practically speaking, which for me means letting the past go, all of that history and the doctrine sources and those who compiled it and the political structures and societal structures that made it such that those were men. Putting all that aside right now and looking at who wakes up, I can tell you that it's just as likely for a man to wake up as a woman, as someone who is asexual, as someone who is gender fluid. So I don't see that gender necessarily plays into whether or not someone can have that initial shift. In the past, I've sort of observed that women seem to wake up a little faster than men, but it's really hard to say that. I see people wake up at all ages, all genders, all interests, all political positions, atheists, Christians, Buddhists, all kinds of people wake up. Now, what's interesting is when I consider those who I would say, in my experience, are liberated, truly liberated, full realization of no self, which is a much smaller number than the number of people who have awakenings. It's available to anybody, but I would say statistically it's much lower. In my experience, there's more women than men, actually. Well, the people I can think of that are liberated, clear no self-realization, hold no inherent view, have fully realized the non-dual nature of appearances. I know a number of men and women, but I would say certainly more women. This may just be a biased sample for whatever reason, but I actually wonder if that's the case, because I do see a certain type of obstruction or fixation that probably plagues men a bit more than women, generally speaking, that tends to hold people up in deeper stages of realization. And I've talked about this before, but I think it's a little more common in my experience for men to somehow, without recognizing it consciously, but unconsciously hold a belief or view that somehow this process is about not feeling. As simple as that sounds, that can be a big fixating point. Call it bypassing, whatever. There are gross, ways to bypass, but there are also very subtle ways to bypass. So perhaps that's what this is. And the men I see liberated have gone thoroughly and with very open hearts, open minds, and willingness through the emotion body, with a willingness to feel everything. Those are the men I come in contact with that I would say are truly liberated. I would say, generally speaking, I find that this is a little more perhaps natural for women, this part of things. I don't know why necessarily. Could it be physiologic? Sure. Could it be gender roles and societal assignment of those roles? Sure. Combination? Sure. Don't really think it matters, actually. Because this that I point to, this possibility of liberation, is available to anyone. You will ultimately move beyond all identity with everything, including gender or lack of gender, race, age, physicality. You will go beyond all of that. But what holds us up are those fixations, those identities around those fixations, the very deep impression we have that that's defining us in some way. So I suspect that this observation I have, which again, because the number is relatively small, it could just be random chance. But but I do suspect it has something to do with that. There's another aspect to it that I think, just in my observation, women are a little more, or maybe a lot more initially in tune with, and that is this movement of surrender. Again, without getting into a bunch of detail about what might be behind that, because I'm not sure it matters actually. And again, all of this can be unlearned. These are habits. These are tendencies. And anyone can release themselves from the bindings of them. But I want to say this, the reason I made this video actually was to kind of point to this, that those two areas I think can be sticky points. Well, not can be, they are sticky points for everyone. But I think they can be a little more elusive for men. And that is the willingness to just feel. I did an interview with Josh a few months ago, really good interview, and he is a liberated human being. And one of the things he said I loved was, after his initial awakening, he spent a handful of years, the way he described it was daily. He said, I felt every emotion that you can feel every single day. Like it was just a cascade of emotion. And he just met it again and again and again and again and again. That kind of surrender in the emotion body is powerfully transformative. And I think everyone learns it at some point, but you'll fight it for a long time. And it really can be the holdup, I think, in deeper stages of realization. And men and women do it for sure. Everyone does this. But I think it can be a little more elusive for men that is what you have to do. Like the instinct that that's where you have to go, I think is a little more accessible for women typically. But again, I'm not really trying to make a big statement about gender or anything here. Mostly I just want to say, that these are my observations, and they are completely counter to what you would see if you considered, the historical texts and teachers being men and so forth. You could easily make an assumption that for some reason, whatever it is, it's more likely for men to wake up or more likely for men to be liberated. I suspect it's probably a little more like the opposite, actually. So yeah, that's the gist of what I wanted to say today, was really just, in deeper stages of realization, don't overlook that stuff. Don't overlook the value of surrender. Adyashanti talks about this all the time. He's very clear on it. He transmits it very well. It's very important. But the best transmission is come into contact with a liberated female teacher. That's very, very powerful medicine. If you have trouble in this area, I can just tell you from my own personal experience, having been in contact with an enlightened female teacher, makes huge change, makes huge transformation, often in a very short time. And it feels often quite different than the typical insight teachings and practices and so forth. It's a very, very deep, gut level, instinctual movement. And it's very powerful. So those are the takeaways. Don't overlook the importance of work in the emotion body. Don't overlook the importance of surrender. Make a study of it, especially in deeper stages of realization if you feel hung up. And lastly, be willing to interact with a liberated female teacher or a liberated male teacher, or both. Hope this is helpful and not too triggering.